The laughter began before Samuel Carter even moved in, because news traveled quickly through Pine Hollow, especially ridiculous news. And according to nearly everyone in the valley, choosing to live in an abandoned stone barn qualified as ridiculous. A barn. You planning on sleeping beside cattle too? Roof leaks. Walls crack. Probably full of mice. Harlan Pike laughed hardest. He stood outside the general store one morning, shaking his head, while others gathered around. Samuel inherited a proper cabin, and somehow picked the barn instead. That part was technically true. Samuel had inherited his late uncle's property at the western edge of Pine Hollow. 40 acres, a weathered cabin, a small pasture, and an old stone barn sitting farther uphill against the trees. The cabin looked normal. The barn didn't. Built almost 70 years earlier by Scottish settlers, the structure had thick stone walls nearly 3 feet across and massive timber beams blackened by decades of smoke and age. Tom had worn it down. The upper loft sagged slightly. Moss grew between some stones. One side door leaned crooked beneath rusted hinges. Most people saw something old. Samuel saw something different. Mass. That was the first thing he noticed. Not beauty. Not size. Mass. Because Samuel had spent 6 years working quarry camps farther north where winter temperatures dropped hard enough to freeze tools left outdoors. The workers there learned strange lessons quickly. Thin buildings warmed fast. And cooled fast. Heavy stone changed slowly. That mattered. Stone absorbed heat slowly. Released heat slowly. Resisted temperature swings naturally. During winter, once thick walls warmed through, they acted almost like enormous batteries storing heat inside themselves. Samuel remembered sleeping beside heated quarry walls that remained warm hours after fires died. The memory stayed with him, especially after spending one night inside his inherited cabin. The place looked sturdy enough from outside. Inside was another story. Drafts slipped between logs. Cold gathered near corners. By dawn, frost lined the interior windows despite a fire burning half the night. Samuel sat there watching breath drift in front of his face and quietly reached a decision. The cabin could wait. The barn couldn't. People thought he was joking at first, until he started moving supplies. Blankets, food, wood, tools. Everything went uphill toward the old stone structure. Then the valley laughed harder than ever. Children followed him one afternoon asking questions. You really living in there? Where you putting the cows? Samuel smiled faintly. No cows. Then why a barn? He looked toward the thick stone walls glowing beneath autumn sunlight. Because winter doesn't care what a building used to be. Nobody understood what that meant. Not yet. The work took nearly 6 weeks. Samuel didn't rebuild the barn completely. He adapted it. The lower level remained mostly open, but he constructed insulated living quarters within the thickest interior section where stone walls surrounded 3 sides naturally. He repaired roof gaps using reclaimed timber and packed moss insulation beneath the beams. Most importantly, he built a smaller room inside the larger structure. That confused people badly. Caleb Turner visited one evening while Samuel worked. He stood watching from the doorway with folded arms. You're building a cabin inside the barn? Not exactly. Samuel hammered another support brace into place. Then what? A warm room. Caleb frowned. Samuel explained slowly. Heating large spaces wastes fuel. Heating protected spaces inside insulated mass wastes much less. The stone barn itself blocked wind and weather while the smaller living quarters trapped concentrated warmth where it mattered. Layers. That was the secret. Outer protection. Inner protection. Less exposure. Caleb looked around uncertainly. You really think this works? Samuel glanced toward the thick stone walls surrounding them. I think people forgot why buildings like this survived so long. Because old builders understood something modern builders often ignored. Survival mattered more than appearance. The first winter winds arrived in early November. Northern gusts rolled across Pine Hollow carrying sharp cold behind them. Families sealed windows. Stacked extra wood. Checked roofs. Samuel watched the barn carefully. The difference appeared almost immediately. Wind struck the stone walls. And disappeared. No rattling boards. No shaking timbers. No drafts sliding through cracks. The massive walls simply absorbed pressure. Not fighting. Not flexing. Enduring. Inside the smaller living quarters, the temperature changed slowly. Very slowly. Samuel noticed it first after several freezing nights. The stove warmed the room naturally, But something else happened afterward. Hours later, warmth remained. Long after the fire burned low, the surrounding stone gradually absorbed heat during the day and released it back through the night. Not intensely, steadily, like stored sunlight returning after dark. Caleb noticed too during another visit. He stepped inside, removed his gloves, then frowned. "You still have heat in here." Samuel looked up from the kettle. "Of course. The fire's almost dead." Samuel tapped one of the stone walls beside him. "The fire isn't holding it." Caleb pressed his palm carefully against the stone. Not hot, but not cold either. The wall felt alive somehow. Stable. How? "Massachusetts." Caleb looked confused again. Samuel smiled slightly. "Stone remembers temperature longer than wood does." Word spread quietly through Pine Hollow after that. Not enough to stop the jokes, but enough that people started paying attention. Because Samuel used less firewood too. Not dramatically at first. Steadily. While others fed stoves constantly during early freezes, Samuel burned smaller fires and somehow stayed comfortable. Even Harlan noticed eventually, though he refused to admit concern openly. Then December arrived, and with it came strange weather from the north. Old ranchers stopped smiling. Pressure dropped rapidly. Birds vanished. The air changed. Stories began spreading through Pine Hollow. Stories about a winter front building beyond the mountains. A bad one, maybe the worst in years. People reinforced roofs, stacked wood higher, secured shutters tightly. Samuel did something different. He moved more supplies into the stone barn. Extra water, food, blankets, lantern fuel. Caleb watched uneasily. "You expecting something?" Samuel looked toward the northern sky. Dark clouds gathered low across the horizon. "I don't think winter's coming." Caleb frowned. "What does that mean?" Samuel stared toward the mountains. "I think it's arriving." 3 days later, the first snow began falling. The first snow looked harmless. Soft flakes drifted down across Pine Hollow while children ran between cabins catching them on mittened hands. People smiled. People always smiled at the first snow. Then the wind arrived. By sunset, the northern sky had darkened into a wall of moving gray. Temperatures dropped so quickly that water buckets glazed with ice within an hour. Smoke from chimneys flattened low across the valley instead of rising. Samuel stood outside the stone barn watching carefully. He had seen weather like this before. Not often, but enough. Storms that began quietly sometimes became the dangerous ones. Because people prepared for violence, they rarely prepared for patience. The snow thickened overnight. Then it kept falling. Morning arrived hidden behind white haze and screaming wind. Fence lines disappeared first. Then sheds. Then entire sections of road vanished beneath drifts moving like waves across the valley. Cabins began fighting winter immediately. Roaring fires burned day and night. Families stuffed cloth beneath doors. Men climbed roofs trying to clear snow before weight built too heavily. Inside the stone barn, Samuel did something different. He waited. The thick walls barely reacted to the storm outside. Wind struck stone and dissolved into dull, muffled sounds. The interior living quarters remained calm beneath lantern light, while the stove burned steadily in the corner. Most importantly, the temperature stayed stable. Not hot, not cold. Stable. The stone walls had spent weeks absorbing warmth from small daily fires. Now they released that stored heat slowly back into the room. Samuel barely needed to feed the stove. That unsettled him more than if the storm had hit harder. Because outside the blizzard only grew stronger. Near midnight, pounding shook the heavy barn doors. Samuel opened them against fierce wind and nearly lost his grip. Caleb Turner stumbled inside, carrying his younger sister beneath blankets. Snow exploded into the entrance before Samuel slammed the doors shut again. For several moments, neither spoke. Caleb simply stared around the barn. The lanterns glowed softly. The stove burned low. And despite the blizzard raging outside, the room felt comfortable. "How?" Caleb finally asked. Samuel removed snow from the girl's shoulders. The walls already did most of the work. Caleb looked toward the stone surrounding them. "The fire barely has anything in it." Samuel nodded. "Exactly." Another knock came less than an hour later. Then another. Harlan Pike arrived with his wife after part of their roof collapsed beneath wet drifting snow. Mrs. Tolland appeared carrying her grandson wrapped tightly inside quilts. Then came the Miller family. Then old Mr. Wexler. By morning, nearly a dozen people crowded inside the structure everyone once mocked. Nobody laughed anymore. Outside, Pine Hollow disappeared beneath the storm entirely. Snow buried windows. Roofs groaned under growing pressure. Wind forced itself through cracks in wooden walls and stole heat faster than fires could replace it. Inside the stone barn, something different happened. The massive walls resisted sudden change completely. Heat moved slowly. Cold moved slowly. Everything slowed. Samuel finally explained it while adding another modest piece of wood to the stove. "Cabin's warm air first," he said quietly. Everyone looked toward him. "Air changes quickly. Stone changes slowly." Harlan frowned. "What does that mean?" Samuel rested one hand against the wall beside him. "It means the storm has to freeze all this before it freezes us." Silence followed, because everyone suddenly understood. The walls themselves had become part of the heating system, not through fire, through stored energy. Days passed. The storm kept coming. Snow drifted halfway up the barn exterior, while neighboring buildings vanished beneath white hills across the valley. Yet inside the old stone structure, people slept safely. Children played quietly beside lantern light. Meals cooked steadily over modest flames. No one fed giant fires through the night. No one woke shivering beside frozen walls. The barn simply held, not fighting winter, outlasting it. When the storm finally weakened 3 days later, Samuel opened the heavy doors carefully. No one moved behind him. They were afraid to see what remained. Outside, Pine Hollow looked broken. Several cabin roofs had collapsed entirely. 2 sheds disappeared beneath drifts. One chimney lay shattered across a road no longer visible. But the stone barn still stood exactly where it always had. Snow covered its roof. Wind scratched harmlessly across its walls. Smoke rose calmly into pale morning light. Word spread through Pine Hollow faster than the storm itself once roads reopened. People walked uphill simply to see the old stone structure that survived the blizzard better than almost every cabin in the valley. They expected hidden furnaces or giant fires or some secret machine buried beneath the floor. Instead, they found thick walls, a smaller insulated room, and a stove hardly larger than anyone else owned. Questions followed immediately. How thick should stone walls be? Would brick work too? Why build a smaller room inside a larger space? Samuel answered patiently because winter had already done the convincing for him. Mass mattered. Layers mattered. Heating smaller protected spaces mattered most. People spent years believing survival depended entirely on bigger fires. Bigger fires only replaced heat already escaping. The smarter answer was slowing the escape itself. By late winter, families started changing their homes. Some added stone storage rooms beneath cabins. Others built thick wind barriers around exposed walls. Several created smaller insulated living spaces inside larger structures specifically for deep winter storms. Nobody called the old barn ridiculous anymore. Children stopped calling it Carter's stable. Adults stopped laughing beside the trading post. The blizzard settled every argument without saying a single word. Travelers passing through Pine Hollow began stopping beside the barn as well. Some touched the walls curiously. Others measured the stone thickness with outstretched hands. A few simply stood quietly studying the structure from a distance, trying to understand how something built for livestock somehow protected people better than houses designed specifically for living. The questions never really stopped after that winter ended, and the snow finally retreated from the valley completely. Even Caleb admitted it one evening, while watching smoke rise quietly from the roof. "People thought you chose the strangest building in the valley," he said. Samuel looked toward the stone walls and smiled. "No," he replied. "I chose the oldest idea in it."